Well, I want to thank Steve, who is not a scientist. He's an ordinary citizen, but is intelligent enough to be deeply concerned about all issues facing life on this planet. And I really respect and admire you, Steve, for bringing this conference together. And I hope, like you, that someone out in the audience really grabs this, you know, maybe a millionaire or a billionaire or something, and decides to spend their money, his or hers, to save the creation. So, I've got 3 things to address today: nuclear war, nuclear power, which I actually did the other day. Hands up those who are here for that lecture. Not all of you. And global warming, which we kind of did last night. So I'll start the lecture by saying this. As a physician, I'm trained to assess a patient, taking a detailed medical history, then conducting a careful physical examination, which most doctors don't do today. They write on their computers, but they don't undress you and fully examine you, which you must do because you're going to miss things if you don't properly examine a patient. This is followed by a series of laboratory tests which guide me to a diagnosis. Appropriate treatment follows after the illness is diagnosed and the cause is defined. It is imperative that the main disease is attended to and the assessor not be distracted by peripheral issues or unrelated complaints. And this applies to the planet. I look at the world and its ongoing pathology from a similar perspective. There are many serious issues facing the world at the moment, but it's necessary to triage the most serious threats, those who are very survival. And triage comes from war. Like, I'm sure you've all watched MASH. When patients come in, you have to triage. This one's hopeless and is actually dying. This one is very serious, but we can probably fix this one, and this one's probably going to be okay. It is easy to be diverted or distracted by lesser threats, like worrying about what sort of food you're eating. This must be avoided. As a physician, I see the ever-present threat of nuclear war as an ongoing existential risk that threatens almost all planetary life with extinction. The situation is even more acute because most people and politicians become inured to or are unaware of the existential nature of this threat. This is a dangerous form of psychic numbing. The truth is that Russia and the US possess 94% of the 16,400 nuclear weapons or hydrogen bombs in the global nuclear arsenal today. The US maintains its first strike winnable nuclear war policy, which I'll describe in a while, and both countries have raised their nuclear arsenals to a higher state of alert because of the trouble in the Ukraine. And you probably are not following this, but it's extremely serious. Furthermore, it has just been announced that the administration, Obama, has plans to replace every nuclear warhead and their delivery system via ship, submarine, missile and plane at a cost of $1 trillion over the next 30 years, and that's your money. And recently, Stephen Hawking and his colleagues have been postulating that there's a real possibility that computers could launch a nuclear war with no human input within the next 10 years. Artificial intelligence. So I held a symposium on this subject at the New York Academy of Medicine on February the 28th, March the 1st, and I postulated these questions. 1, what are the human and technological factors that could precipitate a nuclear war between Russia and the US? How many times have we come close to nuclear war, and how long will our luck hold? 2, what are the ongoing technological and financial developments relevant to the nuclear weapons arsenals of the US and Russia? 3, what problems are associated with lateral proliferation? That means other countries getting bombs, like Saudi Arabia has just announced it will, and incidentally, Saudi Arabia is funding ISIS. What problems are associated with lateral proliferation of nuclear weapons via strenuous corporate marketing of nuclear technology? 4, what are the medical and environmental consequences of either a small or large nuclear war? 5, what are the underlying philosophical, political and ideological dynamics that have brought life on Earth to the brink of extinction? 6, how can we assess the situation from an anthropological perspective? 7, what is the pathology within the present political situation that could lead us to extinction? And 8, how can this nuclear pathology be cured? So I assembled a raft of absolutely wonderful people, speakers, who addressed this issue. We sent out press notices to the whole press. The New York Times did not cover it, neither did the mainstream media. So they're practicing psychic numbing too. And somehow we have to wake them up. So I guess I'll start. Well, I talked about this last night in my talk. Hands up here, those who were here last night? No. Okay, so I'll go through it again. Well, I first came to America in 1966 with 3 babies under 3. And I got a job part-time at Harvard Medical School, where I worked with Harry Schwachman, a pioneer in cystic fibrosis, at the Cystic Fibrosis Clinic. And it was an amazing thing to work at Harvard Medical School. Some of the very best paediatricians in the world worked there, and there was a sort of a humility amongst the most senior doctors who were always looking for knowledge and honesty. So I worked there for 3 years, and I won't go into the whole thing, but during those 3 years, 66 to 69, I saw a democracy in action. It was a civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was shot. It was the anti-Vietnam War movement, huge. Bobby Kennedy was shot. I got up one really hot, humid morning, turn on the television, and there was Bobby lying on the floor bleeding to death from his head. And Nixon was elected, clearly a paranoid man. And I saw a democracy really in action, and it was a wonderful, wonderful feeling. I went back to Australia, which is kind of half asleep. Everyone's frightfully nice, and they're all they're like the Canadians, very polite and the like. But I became concerned about nuclear war when I was about 17, and I read a book called On the Beach by Neville Shute. I don't know if any of you have seen the film by Stanley Kramer, but it was about a nuclear war that occurred by accident in the Northern Hemisphere, and everyone died. And some Americans came down in a submarine to Australia. And gradually, the fallout started to move south. And it was apparent that in Melbourne, which is where I lived and the book was set, that we were doomed. Because as the radiation came down, we would develop acute radiation illness. And that is manifest by the most actively dividing cells of the body dying. So your hair falls out, you get terrible ulcers in your GI tract and vomiting and bloody diarrhea, and you die of bleeding because the platelets, which form clotting, are killed in the bone marrow. And it was just an ordinary story of ordinary people dealing with the fact that their babies are going to die. And eventually the government dispensed cyanide capsules so that people could kill their babies like that rather than dying of these horrific symptoms. And that was all acted out by some wonderful actors in the film, but also in the book. And at the end of the film, there was St. George was slaying the dragon outside the Melbourne Public Library. I was there the other day. A blind was gently flapping in the breeze. Bits of paper were flying down in the wind. The trams were sitting there. And that was the end of life on Earth, or human beings. I was 17 or 16, an innocent teenager looking forward to falling in love, smelling the orange blossom, doing all the lovely things that you do when you're young. And that put a blight on my life, and I really never recovered. And being of curious disposition, I read everything I could find then about nuclear weapons. And then I went to medical school age 17 and I learned about radiation, and there was a man called Muller who irradiated Drosophila fruit flies. And because they reproduce very fast, you can watch the genetic mutations that radiation causes and follow them generation to generation, like a crooked wing or abnormal eyes or that sort of thing. Whereas with us, you can't follow it because our generations are long-lived. And at the time, Russia and America were blowing up bombs in the atmosphere. And I couldn't understand what these men were doing because they knew what radiation meant. Madame Curie had died of cancer, her daughter had died of leukemia. We knew what radiation meant. The old radiologists used to put their hands underneath the beam of the X-ray to see if it was accurate. Many of them died of cancer. My ex-husband was a radiologist. He was careful. He used to wear a lead apron, but he developed cancer. His colleague developed cancer. So we knew then what radiation does. And yet these really wicked men were exposing millions and billions of people in the northern hemisphere to radiation. And what you need to know is there is an increase in cancer. We all know that. The National Cancer Institute estimated there were 114,000 extra cases of thyroid cancer from the fallout. These people are murderers. But it's not just thyroid cancer. Radiation, when you imbibe it, eat it, or get it into your lung, can cause every sort of cancer that we know and have described. And so I became pretty cynical. When I was in America, I read the New York Times voraciously. I listened to NPR. I was there when Martin Luther King was killed. And there was a wonderful man on NPR in Boston, I can't remember his name, Louis Lyons, I think, and he was almost crying. And he said, "Why aren't we all out in the streets protesting?" It was an amazing period. I then came back to Harvard as I and my husband were both offered jobs at Harvard on the faculty where I worked. And I had already, what happened was in 1971, someone leaked some data about fallout in the water in Adelaide where I lived, because the French, who were previously blowing their bombs in the desert in Algeria, were kicked out of Africa, and they came down to the islands in the South Pacific and started blowing the bombs up there. And we were getting a lot of fallout. So I wrote a letter to the paper. I just read Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch, so I was pretty liberated. I wasn't going to be told no anymore. I don't know if you've read that book, but it changed my life. Anyway, so and I wrote a letter saying that children could get leukemia and cancer from the fallout from the French tests, and they didn't publish the letter. So I rang the editor and I said, "Where's my letter?" And he's very condescending, as men tend to be sometimes to women. And he said, "Well, madam, we get hundreds of letters a day." And I said, "Yes, but mine's important." And I talked him through it. He got it out of the waste paper basket, undid it, and published the letter. And then that night I was asked to be on television. I knew a lot, but not everything. I made mistakes, but that's how you learn about life. And I was attacked by the head of nuclear medicine at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, this hysterical woman doctor, and it was headlines in the paper. But I kept going, and I was right. I had a lot of exposure, and what I didn't know was the Australians didn't like the French. They think they're arrogant. Well, they are, and I've got a French son-in-law who's a count, and they are arrogant. My grandchildren are half French and they're half mad. Anyway, and my daughter's a countess, a less likely countess you could hardly believe. Anyway, so the Australians said, "Those bloody French, what are they down here testing their bombs and irradiating us?" People stopped buying French wine, French perfume, French cheese. The mailman wouldn't deliver French mail, and it was just huge. There were spontaneous marches in the city streets with fathers with babies on their shoulders with signs saying, "I don't want to die of leukemia from French nuclear tests." And in 9 months, 75% of Australians rose up and said, "We're not going to have those bloody French here anymore." And we forced our Prime Minister and New Zealand to take France to the International Court of Justice, and she started testing underground. Well, that wasn't good either, because out of sight is out of mind, but we didn't get any fallout. So I thought, I saw what Jefferson said, your wonderful president, an informed democracy, will behave in a responsible fashion. That's what happened. Then in 1975, I found our Prime Minister, who was a good man, decided he'd like to mine uranium. I knew nothing about uranium. I went to the library and I read a book called, by Goffman and Tamplin, Nuclear, I can't remember the name of it, which is bad. Anyway, my hair nearly fell out. I'd never read anything so dangerous in my medical career. So I went to see the Prime Minister, but he wasn't interested. Before I was quoted by Rupert Murdoch on the front of The Australian, you know, because we had an external enemy, and it's good to have an external enemy because the whole country, like a tribe, congregates to hate the enemy, which is what is happening today and always has. And I want to write a book about that. Why men kill and why women let them. Anyway, so I had a friend who was an engine driver. And at that stage, most of our workers were unionised. There were 76 unions in South Australia. And we wrote to the unions and said, can I come and talk to them about the medical dangers of mining uranium? And they said, yes, but you'll never convince us because we need the jobs, 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 jobs. I'm sure Hitler said that when he was building the gas ovens, create jobs. That's what you hear all the time. It's nothing to do with jobs. And so I travelled all around Australia talking to unions at 6 in the morning before they went out and all sorts of stuff. And finally I ended up before a big union conference. Australian men drink a lot of beer. They were well lubricated by the time I got there, and I had 10 minutes. I was premenopausal and I looked okay. And I had a nice pair of black velvet slacks, but they didn't lift. So for the first 5 minutes they were very rude and talked loudly, and I thought, what am I going to do to get their attention? So I started talking about the medical effects of radiation upon their testicles. And if there's one pair of organs that Australian men really care about, it's their testicles. You could have heard a pin drop. They listened in rapt silence for the next 5 minutes. I got through the whole thing and they said, oh, we don't want our kids growing up in a world like that. They sent a telegram to the Prime Minister. The next thing, a man was asked to shunt a truck of yellow cape uranium in Queensland. He refused, and the whole Australian Railways Union went out on strike, and no one could get to work for 24 hours. And so it hit the headlines. So there are always ways, asymmetrical ways, to mobilise a nation. And once again, it was education that did it, of the unions. No, and their testicles were important because, of course, in the sperm are the genes for future generations, like the Drosophila fruit fly, handing on genetic diseases. And my specialty is the most common fatal genetic disease of childhood, cystic fibrosis. 1 in 25 Caucasians carry the gene. There would be some carriers here. In fact, we all carry several hundred genes for disease. And the more radiation we're exposed to, the more genetic abnormalities will appear. There are over 2,600 genetic diseases now described: diabetes, cystic fibrosis, haemophilia, dwarfism. And guess what? A few years ago, my oldest beloved son was diagnosed with hemochromatosis. A recessive gene from both my husband and I gave him that disease. It's like blue eyes. You can't have blue eyes unless you have two blue-eyed genes, because they're weak. If you have a brown-eyed gene and a blue-eyed gene, you'll have brown eyes, and don't know you carry the blue-eyed gene. Do you see? I always give a puzzle to my audience. There were two blue-eyed parents, and they had a brown-eyed baby. Where did the brown eyes come from? What?
The father, the real father.
Who was the real father? The milkman. Yeah. So you can use genetics for various pathology and investigational opportunities. So, yeah, hemochromatosis is a disease where the body can't handle iron. And we break red blood cells down all the time. They're full of iron. If you taste blood, you can taste iron. And so it builds up in the heart muscle and also in the liver, and they get cirrhosis. And So he has to be bled, litres of blood every few months. He's okay now. But it was strange that I was walking around the world telling everyone we all carry several hundred genes for disease, and guess what I found out? I did. Anyway, so to get back to the uranium mining, we stopped uranium mining because the Australian Council of Trade Unions passed a resolution that they would neither mine, transport nor export uranium, and the whole country was anti-nuclear. It's changing now, because when I came to America in '78, the corporations moved in silently and gradually, and our country is just one big quarry of iron ore and coal causing global warming, and uranium causing nuclear power and cancer, the whole thing. And I'm seen as a bit of a nut now in Australia. They don't like me. Too bad, and I don't know how to reverse that. But anyway, that's the way it is. So I came to America in '78 to live. And I said last night that when I got here, I was always worried about nuclear war. Most Americans I spoke to said it's better to be dead than red. And you can remember those awful anti-communist days with McCarthy, and, you know, you're a communist, this horrible stuff which the corporations used actually to destroy the unions after the end of the First World War, and I've written all about that in one of my books. And I said, what, you'd rather be killed in a nuclear war? Yes, we don't want to be communist. And I thought, these people are really psychotic. So, and also I was invited by the editor of the New England Journal, Arnold Relman, to write an article about the medical consequences of nuclear power, and I spent an hour, a year researching that in the Countway Library at Harvard, and I wrote the article. It was rejected by peer review because they said, well, you didn't say anything good about nuclear power, and I said, well, there's nothing good medically about nuclear power. It's like making electricity by generating poliovirus, you know. It's very, very dangerous. Got rejected, I got a bit depressed. But anyway, I learnt a lot. And it happened that I just started Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I put an ad in the New England Journal of Medicine about the medical dangers of nuclear power, and it came out the day after 3 Mile Island melted down. And we got 500 new members just like that, and we were operating out of a broom cupboard in an office in Harvard Square. So we were off and running, and Warren Buffett sent us money. I mean, we were really starting to move. And it was quite wonderful. And we held our first symposium at Harvard with the men from the Manhattan Project who made the bombs, George Kistiakowsky, Jerry Wiesner, who was Jack Kennedy's science advisor. Jerry told me a story. He was in the Oval Office with Jack, and there were women outside, Women's Strike for Peace, protesting the fallout from the tests. And he was standing at the Oval Office, and it was raining, and there were raindrops on the window, and he said, "You mean, Jerry, there's radiation in that rain?" And he said, "Yes, Mr. President." Jack gave some wonderful speeches about the concept of nuclear war and children getting leukemia and cancer. So I had these, and Philip Morrison, these men who made the bomb felt incredible guilt about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where they vaporized and killed over 200,000 people. Thus, we entered the nuclear age, where for the first time we could vaporize our fellow human beings. And our first symposium, it was in Boston at Harvard, and all the journalists were there, and they said, what are doctors talking about this for? This is a political issue, nuclear war. And we said, no, it's medical. It will create the final epidemic of the human race. And so we started to get tremendous publicity. And I had an agent called Pat Kingsley who worked with Tom Cruise and Lily Tomlin and Sally Field, and she said, "I'll work for you for free." No one wanted a boring old Australian doctor in a tweed suit talking about nuclear war because it turns the audience off and they won't buy their hemorrhoid cream sort of stuff, or their missile erectors. Not missile erectors, I mean penile erectors, you know, that stuff. So, but if they had the film stars, that was the hook to hang me on. And often I'd do it, you know, on Phil Donahue or 60 Minutes or whatever, and Lily Tomlin, who's very smart, she would have covered the whole subject, so when I got on, she'd really talked about the whole thing. She's a lovely woman. And so we got a lot of publicity, and she put me in Lifetime, Vogue, you name it. And gradually, Mr. and Mrs. Joe Sixpack got to understand about nuclear war. And I knew that the women walking in the supermarkets with their trolleys, loading them up with Coke and all sorts of stuff for their kids, like the women out here today, they started to understand. And over 5 years, because of this education, 80% of Americans became opposed to nuclear war, which was really the Second American Revolution. It was a revolution in thinking, peaceful, sagacious, Gandhian, all about education. And I'd go to the Congress. Every time I went there, I got propositioned by some congressman, you know. Sex is really sort of subliminally always there in Congress. But anyway, I didn't take any notice. I had to try and talk about their genes and radiation and stuff. But I'd go, and Tip O'Neill, that lovely man, was the chairman of the House. And he'd come off the House floor to meet me in his office. Why? Because we had 80% of Americans behind us. That's political power. That's the only way you're going to change things, by changing the people out there. If they don't know, we are absolutely nowhere. And he'd say, "What can I do for you, doctor?" And I said, "I want you to play our film, The Last Epidemic," from one of the symposium, on every single TV set in Congress. And he did. And we got the Congress to pass the nuclear weapons freeze, which was to freeze the arms race between Russia and America, which was quite extraordinary. And Tip said the two most important things he ever did in his political life was the nuclear weapons freeze and also the Maryknoll nuns who were killed in Central America. He was a Catholic. And also, there was another episode which had a big impact, I think, that I had to speak in the Playboy Mansion with Hugh Hefner and the Playgirl of the Year, etc., you know, with their little sort of bunny things at the back. And but to a lot of film stars, most of the film stars in Hollywood, because Playboy magazine was going to excerpt a book called With Enough Shovels. Now, the Federal Emergency Management Agency had plans for you if there's a nuclear war, and I think these plans still hold true. It takes only half an hour for the Russian missiles to hit you from launch to land, and your missiles take half an hour. It's all over in about an hour. But they said, don't worry, if you've got enough shovels to go around, we're all going to make it. And as you hear on NPR, this is an emergency broadcast, we're under nuclear attack, run to the nearest fallout shelter. You get out your trusty shovel and you dig a hole 6 feet long, 3 feet wide and 3 feet deep, and you get in the hole and you put 2 doors on top and dirt. And this man at FEMA said, "TK Jones, it's the dirt that does it. In fact, you're digging your own grave, but you won't have time to do it anyway." And there were plans too to, on the first day after a nuclear war, or as it's going to happen, all the even-numbered number plate cars flee from Boston to go out to some little village in New Hampshire, and the next day the odd number plates. And you're not allowed to take any drugs or alcohol, and you leave food for the dog and cat at home. And if there's a nuclear attack, you park the car beside the road, get out the shovel, and get underneath the car in your hole. This is, and these admonitions, I'm sure, still hold for you, which is absolutely primitive and ridiculous. Anyway, so they were going to insert this book, With Enough Shovels, in Playboy, and I was to speak before these film stars, and Paul Newman was there, here to speak too. And as I came in, Paul Newman came up to me, and I'd never met him, and he kissed my hand, and he was so beautiful, I just about dropped at his feet. He's gorgeous. And my agent said, "Now, Helen, these are film stars, you can be emotional tonight," because mostly I have to be very credible and scientific with my audiences, but film stars are a bit different. And I said, "I want you to go out tonight and look up at the stars and realise we're probably the only life in the universe." Think about that. I'd already asked Carl Sagan, did he think, because he was a friend of mine, there was life in the universe? And he paused for a long time and he said no. And I said, why? And he said, because if any species had reached our stage of evolution, they would have destroyed themselves. And then this tall, skinny girl with long black hair came up to me, and she was Patty Davis, Reagan's daughter. And she said, I think you're the only person on earth who can change my father's mind. I want you to see him. And I did a quick double take, and I said, I'll see him alone, not with Miss Baker or Diva, his advisors, alone. So she rang me 2 days later and said, we've got an hour at the end of his working day. And I said, what time is that? She said 4 o'clock, and I thought, that's a bit strange. Anyway, we had lunch in a French restaurant, and we swept into the southern portico. We went into the downstairs library, in which there were no books. He was a bit late. He came in all dithery, and I shook his hand, hello, Mr. President, and he didn't know where to sit, so I said, you sit there and I'll sit here. Patty was there, but she said nothing, and I said, you probably don't know who I am, do you? He said, you're an Australian. You read On the Beach when you were a young girl, and you're scared of nuclear war. And I said, yeah, that's right. And he said, well, I too am scared of nuclear war, but our ways to prevent it differ. I believe in building more bombs. So we were off to a flying start. He spent more money than all past presidents combined on weapons, all weapons. I'd just written my book, Missile Envy, a la Freud, which is why I made a mistake earlier. I was just full of facts and figures. That's what my brain does. And everything he said was wrong. So I'd stop him and I'd correct him. And you know when he used to get anxious, he'd get quite flushed? It's called a malar flush. And when he got anxious, I'd stop and I'd hold his hand and reassure him. So I quickly established a doctor-patient relationship with him. I was able to assess his IQ, which was about 100, which is very average when you include the Down syndromes and the like, and the very clever people. Wasn't very high. And I came out saying I think he has impending Alzheimer's, which he did, so the diagnosis was accurate. I thought I'd made absolutely no difference to the man at all. But then shortly after that, he started to say nuclear war must never be fought and can never be won. He was a very belligerent man. Remember when he got a microphone, he didn't know it was still on, and said the missiles are about to fly or something, and the bombs are about to start. But something happened. And because Gorbachev had seen us doctors on television in Moscow, he realised what nuclear war really means. And you know, these men talk about numbers and technologies till the cows come home, but they never get it in their gut what it really means, like On the Beach. Which is why I played that film at my last symposium, because you can stay in your neocortex up here in the left brain and never really get down to your soul and what it really feels like. So Gorbachev understood, and he was very intelligent. He and Reagan started to work together, and they met in Reykjavik at Iceland over a weekend. And they almost agreed, two mere men, to abolish nuclear weapons between Russia and America. These are the only countries that can destroy life on Earth. Don't worry about North Korea. Maybe she can blow up New York, so what? We're talking about life on the planet. But Reagan was stuck on Star Wars. He imagined it as this sort of yellow plastic dome with the missiles going boink, 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 and not hitting America. And Gorbachev was obstinate. He knew it wouldn't work. He should have said to Reagan, okay, have your Star Wars, your missile defence, but let's abolish nuclear weapons. So the opportunity was lost. We did all that work. We had 1 million people in Central Park, black lesbians from Harlem, you know, Southern Baptists, Mormons. I met the head of the Mormon church. He was 96. They wanted to put MX missiles, each missile with 10 hydrogen bombs on it, on trains going along train lines in Utah. So I met with the old man, and because I told him what it meant, the Mormon church banned MX missiles in Utah. I mean, it was an amazing time. Then George I was elected, and he actually removed unilaterally some weapons from Europe to help Gorbachev, because he had to get all the weapons back from Ukraine and all the stans back to Moscow so those little new countries wouldn't launch a nuclear war. That was good. And then we got Clinton, who's got no backbone. We handed to Clinton on a silver platter 80% of Americans who wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons. And He did nothing about it. He could have written out a proposal, got into Air Force One, flown to see Boris Yeltsin, who is a hardened alcoholic, totally compliant, and said, Boris, sign here, we're going to abolish nuclear weapons, and he didn't. I resent Clinton enormously. If there's a nuclear war tonight, it's Clinton's legacy. Since that time, the corporations who make weapons, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, who makes aeroplanes, but they're big into nuclear weapons. They're also arming space to fight nuclear war from space. They were worried because they had no reason to sell their weapons anymore. So now I'm going to get into NATO and the Ukraine and what they've done. So the weapons are still there on high alert, and America's policy still is to fight and win a nuclear war. You've got over 1,000 H-bombs on hair-trigger alert. What does that mean? Well, there are two men in the missile silos. If you fly over South Dakota, you can look down and you can see these circles connected by roads. Actually, a bit like this carpet, only the circles are much more stretched out. So there are two men in the missile silos, aged 18 to 21. Yes, sir, no, sir, press the button, sir. Very much trained. Sitting there all day waiting to blow up the planet. They get really bored, they take drugs, they go to sleep down in their missile silos, they have floppy disks, they don't have proper computers, and often their telephones don't work. Many of them have been discharged recently, the officers, because they have been taking drugs or they've been cheating on their exams and the like, because they're fallible human beings. We're all fallible. We don't know what's going on in the Russian missile silos, but it's probably even worse there. Both countries had satellites which detect if one country's launched their missile, and then they can launch their missiles as the other missiles are coming over. But in fact, Russian satellites don't work anymore. They're dilapidated, degraded. So all they've got is an over-horizon radar which detects missiles coming just before they land. And so it's very serious. The Russians are paranoid, and they're the ones who'll kill you, and their bombs are big. There are 60 hydrogen bombs targeted on Washington as I speak, 10 on New York, 10. The 2 airports, the 3 bridges, they target things as if they're using conventional weapons, not nuclear weapons. Every town and city with a population of 50,000 or more is targeted with at least 1 bomb. All universities, all industries. And that holds true for England, Europe, Russia, China. Since the Cold War, America's had the audacity now to target China, Canada, America, and Australia. Now so the official policy of America is to fight and win a nuclear war. How do you do that? Well, people don't matter. People dying is called collateral damage by the Pentagon. You have to kill the missiles. So what you do, and you've got lots of Trident submarines. On each Trident, 24 missiles with 8 hydrogen bombs in each missile. And they're close to the shores near Moscow, and their bombs don't take half an hour. They take 3 minutes to hit Moscow. So what you do is you first decapitate Moscow. Chop its head off. That means you kill Putin so he can't press his button. And then you launch your weapons, and you have to launch 2 hydrogen bombs on each missile silo to kill the missiles. And they've got to land within seconds, because if you don't do it very accurately, you get what's called fratricide, with huge amounts of gravel blowing up, which will destroy the incoming second bomb. Now, because the Russians don't want you to win the nuclear war, because if you destroy their missiles, you've won the war. The fact billions of people die is no worry to the Pentagon at all. And so they've developed a system. They've dug a deep cave in the Ural Mountains, and they've got a missile called the Dead Hand. And if, in fact, they see a first strike coming, they launch this missile, which sends a radio signal to all their missiles to launch by computer control with no human input. Wow. Yeah, wow. Now, so the Russians have got over 1,000 hydrogen bombs targeted at you and Australia. We've got 34 US bases. Now, what are the chances of this happening? Well, I knew Robert McNamara, who was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, and he was in the Oval Office during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he said, "Helen, you don't know how close we came. 3 minutes to a nuclear war." In 1995, America launched a weather satellite from Norway. They had informed the Kremlin lost the data, human fallibility. They launched this missile and they thought, the Russians saw it and thought, God, this is a first strike for decapitation of Moscow. Yeltsin, who drank a bottle of vodka before breakfast, and much more too, he was informed, he was sitting there, and if you don't know, but the president of both countries has what's called a football. It's a case with the nuclear codes, and if you watch Obama, always there's a man, an officer walking behind him with a suitcase. When Obama met with the Pope, underneath the table as he was talking to the Pope was a suitcase with the codes to start a nuclear war. The presidents, by the time the message goes through to Pine Gap in Australia, over to the Strategic Air Command, and then to the president, he has only 3 minutes to decide whether or not to launch. And so there's Yeltsin sitting there with his officers standing over his shoulder saying, "Mr. President, press the button." 3 seconds before that 3 minutes elapsed, the missile veered off course. That's how we're still here. That is not just one example. These things occur several times a year. And then they lose nuclear weapons or they fall out of planes. 2 fell out on North Carolina and didn't explode, but of the 5 safety catches, 4 went off and 1 remained, so North Carolina wasn't blown up. That's called broken arrows if there are accidents with nuclear weapons. They drive nuclear weapons around in Winnebagos with a machine gun under the dashboard to shoot people if they need to. You can't imagine what's going on in this world. Now, because the weapons companies, which take all your tax dollars, 65 cents of every discretionary tax dollar goes to the military-industrial complex, they steal your money. They're socialised. This is a socialist system for nuclear power and nuclear weapons, but not for medicine. So Lockheed Martin was very upset about the end of the Cold War, and when Gorbachev agreed with Reagan or George I that they would end the Cold War, the Berlin Wall came down, that America would not enlarge NATO in all these newly liberated little countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, who were liberated from the ex-Soviet Union. So there's a man called Norman Augustine who kind of ran the Pentagon. I've written all about this, who was the head of Lockheed Martin. He went to the little countries and he said, "Do you want to become a democracy?" This is so rubbishy. Democracy? Join NATO, but to join NATO they had to spend $3 billion on weapons so that they could sell their weapons. So what they've done is violate the pledge that was agreed to Gorbachev, and they've enlarged the NATO countries, which is America, right up to the border of Russia. Can you imagine how America would feel? Well, remember with the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had some missiles and America nearly blew up the world. What if Canada suddenly said, well, we've become part of the Russian bloc? What would America do? It's so provocative. And there are a lot of neocons, very conservative people in the State Department who are pushing this aspect and pushing Putin into a corner. Putin's paranoid, I'm sure, but you don't threaten paranoid patients in a hospital because they're likely to do something really dangerous to you, and I've had people like that. They're very scary. And so now what's happened with the Ukraine, the State Department put $5 billion into the Ukraine and encouraged them to join the EU, European Union. Now, there was a man called Yanukovych who was their president, democratically elected. And there was a big demonstration in Maiden Square, and we think, and a lot of ex-Nazis are are operating with the Americans because there were a lot of Nazis in the Ukraine who were violently anti-Semitic and killed an awful lot of Jews. They're working with the new president, and they worked with a woman called Victoria Nuland from the State Department. I don't know why Obama puts up with this. And so Yanukovych, they finally had this big demo, and Yanukovych fled to Russia. There's more in this than meets the eye. If you join the EU, you have to tighten your belt, which is what happened in Greece. You lose your medical care benefits, you lose free education, all of this stuff, which is why the European nations are reacting. They don't want that. Now, there are people in eastern Ukraine who are Russians. They didn't want to lose their pensions, etc., and they weren't pleased. But what America did was put in Poroshenko, who is an American puppet. So was Hussein in Iraq. He worked for the CIA since he was 21. So many of these corrupt leaders have been in the pocket of America and the CIA, and then they turn against America, and then America bombs the country and kills lots of civilians. The Iraqi war actually ended up killing a million people, half of whom were children. And when they asked Madeleine Albright if she thought that was okay to kill 500,000 children, she said, yes, I think it was worth it. Think of the Nuremberg trials and the Holocaust. Think of how precious a single life is. Think of how America's started so many wars. At the moment, they're bombing what? Yemen, Syria, Iraq. Anyway, so it's made Putin very paranoid. So Putin has put his nuclear weapons on a higher than normal state of alert. During 9/11, because no one knew what was happening, George Bush was in the sky flying home. He'd just been reading My Pet Goat to the children in Florida. Cheney was in the basement of the White House with Rumsfeld. They put the weapons on the highest state of alert from DEFCON 5, 4, 3, 2, and that's just before launch. It was on the website and have taken down a couple of days later. So in a time of heightened international tension and anxiety when no one knows what's happening, the weapons automatically go on a high state of alert. Now, America and Russia have been conducting nuclear war games right next to the borders of each country. It's in the New York Times, but hardly visible. It's not on Fox television. No one knows it's going on. And by human fallibility, high anxiety, someone getting a cerebral tumour and pressing a button at the wrong time, people taking drugs, we can blow ourselves up. Now, let me explain. Where are we? We're in Florida, in Orlando. You'll have quite a few bombs targeted on you. Let me explain what would happen. You know, sometimes you're listening to NPR and you hear, ooh, we are just testing the emergency broadcasting system. This time you'd hear, ooh, you are under nuclear attack, run to the nearest fallout shelter. You have only about 5 minutes to get there by the time the attack's notified, etc. The missile will come in, or the bombs, at 20 times the speed of sound. You won't even hear them. They'll explode here with 6 times the heat inside the centre of the sun. And this is ground zero. It will dig a hole 3/4 of a mile wide and 800 feet deep, turning us, the buildings, and the earth below to radioactive fallout shut up in the mushroom cloud. 5 miles in all directions, everyone's vaporized. A little boy in Hiroshima was reaching up to catch a red dragonfly against the blue of the sky on his hand, and there was a blinding flash, and he disappeared. And if you go to the Hiroshima Museum, there's his shadow on the pavement. 20 miles from here in all directions, everyone will be lethally burnt, lying in what remains of the buildings and what remains of the streets. The White House has been stockpiling huge quantities of morphia just in case there's a nuclear war. But we don't know where it is. We'll be dead and injured too. There'll be no syringes, no doctors. People will be sucked out of buildings by winds of 500 miles an hour, turning into missiles travelling at 100 miles an hour. Windows popcorn, shards of glass decapitating people. And then the whole area will be engulfed in a huge firestorm of 3,000 square miles. Even in winter in Boston, everything will burn. And as these fires burn, huge amounts of black radioactive smoke are shot up into the stratosphere all over the country, and the fires will coalesce right across America, east to west, north to south, and the whole country will burn. And as these cities burn all over the world, the black smoke will rise into the stratosphere. Incidentally, the ozone will be destroyed. So if you do survive in a shelter and you go out, you'll be instantly blinded by the ultraviolet light. It gets sunburn, 3rd-degree sunburn in 3 minutes. This cloud covers the Earth with so thick it blocks out the sun for up to 10 years, creating a short ice age, and everything and everyone will freeze to death in the dark. If you do survive in a full-out shelter, there'll be no food, although they say they should send the old people like me out to gather any food because we won't live long enough to get our cancers. There'll be millions of corpses. And as they decay, the bacteria and viruses multiply and mutate to become more lethal, like polio and the plague and the like. I can go on, but you can imagine what devastation it would be. We are close to that. We are like lemmings walking blindly towards the cliff of nuclear annihilation, worrying about things that don't matter. If you put rats in a cage and threaten them with a lethal situation, they go away and do something totally relevant to that which threatens them, displacement activity. Or we're into manic denial, clothes, food. Let's not think about what really happens. And the media is not teaching us the truth. At least in the 80s, 80% of Americans really knew. Now they don't, and it's more dangerous now because the Cold War's over, but the hot war's on again. And for the first time since the Cold War ended, Russia and America are confronting each other militarily. They are the only countries that can destroy life on Earth. Whereas there's Pakistan and India, each with 200 hydrogen bombs, and they're very volatile. They're always fighting at the border, and you never know what they might. If they have a nuclear war, we'll get what is called nuclear autumn. There will be a hell of a lot of smoke in the Northern Hemisphere, and crops will fail and billions will die. So what's the solution? Well, it's very interesting because the United Nations has just held a conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The nuclear nations signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Who are they? France, arrogant. Britain, extremely arrogant. America, very arrogant. Russia and China. And they signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty saying that they promised that they would get rid of nuclear weapons soon, Article 6. They've done exactly the opposite. You know, America's going to spend $1 trillion in the next 30 years building up its weapons. Why? Because Senator Kyle, that evil little man, said to Obama, I'll let you get SALT II passed, START II passed in the Senate, if you spend $1 trillion on building nuclear weapons. Why Obama went for that, God only knows. So we've got a very hawkish Senate now. We've got John McCain, Senator, the Armed Services Committee chairman. He's never seen a war he didn't want to get into. These men are like little boys in a sandbox. You know, mine's bigger than yours. And they still think they can kill. If we keep killing each other, these weapons will be used. Which is why I'm going to write a book called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. What is it about us that we kill each other? They don't count civilian casualties in Iraq. They only count American soldiers getting killed. They don't, and your poor soldiers come back, little boys who are recruited to the army, seeing pigs snouting around in bodies of dead babies. No wonder they never recover, never recover. I've spent my life trying to save lives My whole life. I can't imagine killing anyone. I'll be killed if someone wants to kill me, but I'm not going to kill anyone. And if we don't stop this crazy sort of glorification of war, you know, you get on a plane and they say the military people get on now, but when they come back, they've got traumatic syndrome and they don't get paid enough and they don't get their medical care adequately. What is this glorification of war? Why has Napoleon got a tomb in Paris when he killed thousands of people? He was a psychopath. Alexander the Great, George Bush. Thou shalt not kill. Life is so sacred. And yet this whole country is geared to killing now. All your money goes to killing. These corporations have to be closed down. And what's the solution? Well, 106 countries at the United Nations unanimously passed a resolution to abolish nuclear weapons. The only countries majorly who fought it are the 6 nuclear nations. How dare they? They see these weapons as some sort of power. I don't know what it is in their midbrain, you know? It's interesting, in the midbrain of men, the 2 impulses which produce, what's that incredible hormone that's like morphine that, you know, when you have an orgasm, you know that lovely feeling you get? Oh, no, it's not oxytocin, no. What? No, I can't think, sorry. But anyway, so, no, it's not adrenaline. Orgasm, that's, when you have an orgasm, it's not adrenaline, it's that gorgeous feeling, you know, you just, well, violence does the same thing. And those 2 impulses are situated very closely in the midbrain of men. And violence is associated with sex. You know, why do they play porno films to pilots who are about to take off from planes and drop bombs? I've met some soldiers who say they ejaculate as they go into battle. It's very interesting, and I want to examine this from a physiological, functional point of view. And the women, you know, we're 52% of the population, and we have no power. Look at Congress, all men with ties. Ties are a symbol of you-know-what, I think. But we have the nurturing hormones, the oxytocin and the estrogen and progesterone to nurture life. And we have to stand up and take over now. We have to take over. How we do that, I don't know, but I'm going to write about it in my book. That doesn't mean to say, you know, we make enemies, but the magic number is 30%. Below 30% representation in an organisation, women vote to please men. Above 30%, there's such mutual reinforcement. They say, no, today we're not voting for missiles, we're voting for milk for children. Has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats or anything like that. It's what we know to be right. So the solution is we have to mobilise again, as we did in the 80s. We have to have another revolution. We have to get on the media somehow. And I don't know, I mean, Greenpeace always gets on the media. I got on the media by making friends with an engine driver. I got on the media by writing a letter to the paper. I got on the media by having an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. I mean, there are lots and lots of ways we can get on the media. But I say to you, and I'm sure there are grandparents here, I've got 7 grandchildren and children. You know, if you really, and how much do you love your own life? How precious is it? How amazing that your sperm, out of the millions that your father ejaculated that night, each different, reached your egg. How sacred is your life? And if you understand how precious life is and where we are on the brink of extinction, you look in the mirror every morning and you say, what am I going to do today to save the world? And that's the only way you'll be able to look in the eyes of your grandchildren and children and all these dear little babies around here everywhere and say, I'm going to make sure you have a future. I won't go into nuclear power because I did that the other day. I won't go into global warming, but there's a solution to that too, and we'll be talking about that tonight. But I think the most important thing to address today is what I did address. So I'll probably end here, and if you have any questions, I'll take a few. Make them profound, related to what I've just said, otherwise we'll lose the feeling in the audience. Now, if you have nightmares, fine. It's like I've told you, you've got a terrible disease, and you'll go through the stages of grief, a la Kubler-Ross, shock and disbelief. Well, she said one thing wrong, I won't believe anything she said. Or I've got fillings in my teeth, you know. Then depression, go through the depression. Allow yourself to be depressed. Don't, take drugs, or don't make yourself feel happy. Feel the feelings. And then anger comes. And if anger is focused in a white-hot beam, suddenly you'll know what you have to do. No one's ever told me what to do. And often when I'm in my garden alone and really quiet, I suddenly know what I have to do. You'll be told. It will come to you. But allow yourself the grief, because that's how you grow psychologically and evolve into what you must do. And honour that. Honour your feelings. I think there are enough really caring people in this room and intelligent enough to really lead the movement. I came here, I was an alien and a young woman, and I actually led the movement against nuclear weapons in America. If I can do that, you're Americans. And I think that people came from all corners of the planet to this country to save the earth. Americans are kind, loving, caring people. They just need to know what's going on. Only if you change, only if this country changes, only if this country changes will we save the planet. Russia won't move unless you do. You'll have no power unless you change. See not the mote in the other person's eye. Look instead for the mote in your own eye. Listen to what this Pope is saying. He's starting to speak great truths as Jesus would have. Maybe I won't take questions. Maybe I'll end now, go away and digest and just stay with the feelings and take in what I said. I've written a lot of books. The best one to probably read is The New Nuclear Danger, George Bush's Military-Industrial Complex, and it's all about the corporations and George Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and the whole thing. So if you want to learn more, because education is key. The New Nuclear Danger, George Bush's Military-Industrial Complex. If you go to my own website, helencaldicott.com, all my books are there. Also, the conference I held this year called The Dynamics of Possible Nuclear Extinction, with colleagues of Hawking, etc. If you go to my, you might find it there, but my other website, helencaldicottfoundation.org, you'll find the live stream of that conference, which is fantastic. I had Chomsky and all sorts of really notable people. And also you'll find there the live stream of the Fukushima Symposium, the medical and ecological consequences of Fukushima. If you watch those two symposia, you'll really understand and learn A, about nuclear war and that threat, and B, about nuclear power and that threat. That covers both. And then global warming, well, I wrote another book called If You Love This Planet about that. Okay, everyone, we've got a big job to do. And God, you feel great when you do the work, because the only way to be happy is not to look at your navel and try and make yourself happy. The only path to happiness is to serve. Thank you.